All right, today we are going to be diving in on the book Marine, the Life of Chesty Puller. Chesty Puller is the most decorated Marine in American history. He has 5 Navy Crosses and many other medals. And so, just for context here, the Navy Cross is the medal right below the Medal of Honor. And he has 5 of those among a whole lot of other awards. He was born in 1898. He joined the Marines when he was 20 years old, and he was in the Marines for 37 years before he retired as a lieutenant general. He fought in a bunch of campaigns starting in Haiti in the early 1920s and then on in Nicaragua in the late 1920s, early 1930s, and then Guadalcanal and the Pacific in World War II. And then also his last combat was in Korea. So that's where he finished off his combat career. The Marine Corps mascot is actually a bulldog named Chesty. It's named after Chesty Puller. And obviously, I guess I should mention Chesty is his nickname. His first name is Lewis, so his name's Lewis Puller. His nickname is Chesty. So why did I want to study this book and take the time to do a podcast on it? There's a line actually on the back of the book. It says, "No officer ever inspired greater courage, loyalty, and devotion from his men, pushed them harder, or served them better." And I think that's a fantastic description of Chesty and something that you see over and over in the book. He was, on top of being a fantastic combat leader, he was also absolutely loved and adored by the men who served under him, right? So it said, "No officer ever inspired greater courage, loyalty, and devotion from his men, pushed them harder, or served them better." And I think that's a line that anyone would be proud to have this describe themselves. I know I would be. So as I was reading this, I was thinking, hey, what can we learn from this man? How can we take the lessons from his story and apply them to our own lives? So that's what we're going to be doing today. I actually first came across Chesty Puller from Jocko's podcast. So Jocko podcast number 121, it came out in April of 2018. And in that podcast, he dives in on this book. And I remember it stood out to me. Number one, there's just incredible war stories. I mean, the stories from Guadalcanal and Korea are just absolutely mind-blowing and heroic. And there's so much bravery and courage shown in those stories that it can't help but hook you. But on top of that, the entire book is just incredibly dense with leadership lessons and life lessons that Chesty learns along the way. And Jocko did a really good job conveying that in his podcast. So I would definitely highly recommend taking the time to go check that out. Like I said, it's Jocko podcast number 121. So the way I'm going to approach the book today is I'm going to start off reading a few stories and descriptions of him. So a few descriptions, and there's just a few of some of the crazy and heroic stories from his time in battle. And then we'll and that'll be mainly so you get an understanding of who he is, how he operates, and how people see him. Then we're going to kind of circle back, touch on his childhood, what he was like as a child, and then dive into 18 lessons that I am walking away with from this book. So with that, let's dive in. This is a description of Chesty from one of the men that worked with him. It says, "He was probably the bravest man I ever knew. His was a cool courage, not one of desperation. About the only way to contact the enemy there was to let them ambush him. He would go anywhere without support, knowing that if he got in a jam, he had to get himself out. He never hesitated. He invited that kind of work." And so as you read the book, this is something that Chesty does over and over and over again, starting in Haiti and then on to Nicaragua, Guadalcanal, and Korea. He is always headed toward the fight. And a lot of times he doesn't know where the enemy is. He's essentially looking to get ambushed. And once he gets ambushed, that's when he knows the fight is on. And so it says, yeah, he would go anywhere without support, knowing that if he got in a jam, he had to get himself out. He never hesitated. He invited that type of work. I thought that was a fantastic description of how he operates in battle. The next one, here's a story from Guadalcanal. So this is in the Pacific during World War II. It says, "A runner from behind Puller was hit in the throat and died quickly. Everyone else hit the ground except for Colonel Puller. First Sergeant William Pennington retained a vivid memory of the moment. The colonel stood there in that grazing fire with the little old stump of a pipe in his face, yelling, 'B Company, 2nd Platoon, in line here.' Machine gun fire kicked up dust all around me, and I stayed down in that knee-high grass like everyone else in the ranks. The old man didn't find too many leaders right there. He was the only Marine you could see standing on that hillside. So this is one story, but it's a very common story throughout the book where they're under fire and a lot of people are ducking. They are hiding, and Chesty Puller is up, standing up, getting the men moving and getting them to fight back. There's so many instances where he's doing stuff like that. Here's another story. As soon as the machine guns opened from cover, the colonel fell to the ground, rolled over, and was on his feet again like a rubber man. He kept that up for several minutes, hit the deck, roll, stand, and bellow orders, then down again spinning. He knew the nips would zero in on him while he was yelling orders, and he kept them buffaloed. He came out without a scratch. Puller continued to shout orders until he got Captain Chester Cockrell's B Company into a line to screen against the concealed Japs' force. "Cockrell, get him up!" And for a moment, the outrageously loud curses of the colonel echoed in the jungle through the firefight. He soon had a skirmish line moving forward, and the enemy was pushed beyond a ridge. And here we go. A grenade fell near the old man, no more than 8 yards away. Captain Zach Cox estimated, but Pullers turned when he saw A Company scattered and yelled, "Oh, that damned thing ain't going off." It helped steady the men. The grenade was a dud. So, like I said, just ton of bravery from here. I mean, that story about how he would be trying to draw fire from the enemy, right? This was another common tactic he would use whenever he was trying to spot out where the enemy was. He would stand up, essentially walk around for a bit. He had a pipe in his mouth so that you could see a little bit of the fire. Once the fire started, he would duck, roll, and then pop up somewhere new. And then that way, now his riflemen would know where the enemy was because they could see where they were shooting from. And then the riflemen could take out the enemy there. So like I said, that's just another common story, another common tactic that he does all the time. And then the last story I wanted to touch on before diving in on his childhood is a story from Korea. So a little bit of context here. This is in the Korean War. This is getting into the winter of 1950, and Chesty and his Marines are essentially the rear guard for, he would not call it a retreat, but essentially the American forces are pulling back. They realize they're facing hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers, and so they're essentially pulling back, and Chesty and his Marines are the rear guard. And this is from the Chosen Reservoir, if you've heard that term. That's where this story comes from. So it says, there was a snowstorm in the morning. It screened Chinese foxholes on hills above the perimeter and muffled artillery fire from the road to the pass, where the 1st Marine Division was fighting its way to the south. It was December 8th, 1950, on the frozen plateau of Kodo-ri in the North Korean mountains. The troops were the 1st Marine Regiment, rear guard in one of the tragedies of American military history. A funeral was in progress. The thermometer by the commander's tent stood at 25 degrees below zero at dawn when the first men tried to dig graves. Their packs were useless in the iron-hard earth. Dynamite crews set off blasts, but the earth heaved up in enormous black blocks of ice. The commander halted them. More than 100 bodies waited in a row of tents, stiffly frozen, stacked like cordwood. They'll stay like that until the spring thaw, the commander said, but we can't leave them to the wild dogs. Blast out those potato sellers. So essentially, they're in the frozen mountains. It's 25 degrees below zero. They are trying to bury 117 soldiers who have died and are now frozen, and they are trying to dig up the earth, and they are failing at doing that. And so there's these potato sellers that they're going to have the tanks blow out so they can have a hole in the ground to bury these men. When the holes had been opened, the officer called in a battalion of tanks for the burial, for there was no other way. The beams of headlights were lost in the swirling snow, and the roaring of the motors was carried away in the wind as the tanks made the graves, back and forth, crunching icy blocks of earth upon the frozen bodies. The tanks buried the dead. The commander was Colonel Lewis Puller, 52 years old, 32 years, a U.S. Marine. All right, another story here from Korea. It says, for 2 weeks, Puller had commanded the rear of the 1st Marine Division, cut off in the Chosen Reservoir region by hundreds of thousands of Chinese communist troops. The colonel was visiting a hospital tent where a priest administered last rites to Marine wounded when a messenger came. "Sir, do you know they've cut us off? We're entirely surrounded." "Those poor bastards," Puller said. "They've got us right where we want them. We can shoot in every direction now." So that's one of the infamous lines from Chesty Puller. Like I said, they're retreating from the chosen reservoir. They're facing hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops. Him and his Marines are the rear guard, and they find out that the Chinese have cut them off, so they have them completely encircled. And Chesty's response when he hears this news is, "Those poor bastards, they've got us right where we." He says, "Those poor bastards, they've got us right where we want them. We can shoot in every direction now." So Chesty's just out there. He's getting after it. He's looking for a fight. He's ready for it. And so that gives you a little bit of an understanding of what Chesty is like and how he operates on the battlefield. So with that, let's move on to Chesty's childhood and see kind of what he was like as a child. So this is a story from early in his life. He grew up near the Virginia Military Institute. And so here we go to the book. This is his mother talking to her kids, and obviously Chesty is one of them. It says, "Boys, you must be proud of the Confederacy." So he grew up in Confederate territory, and you got to remember this is not long after the Civil War. "Boys, you must be proud of the Confederacy, but it's a mighty good thing that the United States won the war, as terrible as it was. We couldn't live except as one people." There were pictures of great Confederates in the Puller home, Lee and Jackson in particular, but there were older heroes too, from Caesar to Augusta to Gustavus. When his mother first read to him of Genghis Khan, Louis was so smitten that his next trip to Richmond, he bought a book about the Mongol conqueror from his ammunition hoard. There, too, he saw his first parade of Confederate veterans, with the still erect figure of Colonel John B. Gordon at the head of shuffling thousands of aging men in gray. The city had been turned over to them, and many were so far gone in drink that they toppled from windows or lay in the streets while their compatriots marched before cheering crowds. So Chesty's a young boy, and he's watching these veteran Confederate soldiers march down the street. It says, "Young Lewis had an almost clinical interest in these war veterans, and once asked Sergeant Eastwood, 'But how did we lose the war when there were so many of them left alive? Why didn't we fight until everybody was dead? I wouldn't have given up.'" So you see early on, Chesty's reading these books, learning from history, reading about great commanders. He looks up to these Confederate veterans, and I thought that was really interesting, especially as you read through the book and you realize how much he's looking for a fight and how much just a person who gets after it he is. You can understand that as a child he was confused and he's asking the question, wait, how did we lose the war if there's still so many soldiers still alive? I thought that everyone would be dead if we had lost the war. Like, why did we give up? And then it says, Eastwood gave him a long look. "Boy, you're John Puller's grandson. I can see that. Flesh and blood. It's neck or nothing with you Pullers." So obviously that runs in the blood of his family. Here we go. Here's another story from his childhood. It says, "His efforts at translating Caesar made him impatient for the true message of the soldier author. And when he bought a pony in Richmond," and I actually had to look up what a pony is. A pony is essentially just a translated version of it. It says, "When he bought a pony in Richmond, he was so fascinated by the narrative of war that he devoured it in one night. It opened a new world for him and began a lifelong career of serious military reading." Right? And so as I was reading this, and this is a common theme throughout the book, Chesty Puller reads a lot and he is studying the campaigns of previous veterans. That reminded me of Napoleon Maxim number 78. I touched on this in the podcast with Jed a few weeks back, but Napoleon Maxim number 78 says, "Peruse again and again the campaigns of Alexander, Hannibal, Caesar, Gustavus, Turenne, Eugene, and Frederick. Model yourself upon them. This is the only means of becoming a great captain and of acquiring the secret of the art of war. Your own genius will be enlightened and improved by this study, and you will learn to reject all maxims foreign to the principles of these great commanders," right? That is what Chesty is doing here as a young boy. He is reading these campaigns of these generals over and over and over again. He's soaking them up and he's learning from them, right? When I read this maxim from Napoleon, I think that's essentially what I'm trying to do with this podcast, right? Study these figures from history, whether it's folks like Chesty Puller from the military or Steve Jobs and Naval from the business world, right? Studying the campaigns of those people who have been successful before us and learning from them and acquiring the secret art of war or just how to live your life. That is what we're doing here. And that is what Chesty Puller was doing as a young boy. Here we go. Here's another story. This is actually from when Chesty was in boot camp. So the author, Burke Davis, on top of studying Chesty, he's interviewing a lot of folks that interacted with Chesty throughout his career. And this is a quote from the drill instructor, whose name is Despar, and describing how Chesty was in Marine boot camp. And he says, hell, he gives me an inferiority complex. I've read some, but that kid knows von Clausewitz backwards. And guys I'd never heard of by the dozen. He's some kid. This stuff is like religion with him. He takes in all this stuff about the Huns and their atrocity. He hates them like sin. All right, here's another quote from boot camp. It says, Lewis took off like a veteran and on the first afternoon had his men going passively through squad movements, a process usually requiring 2 or 3 days. Within a week, Puller had the platoon on his own. Despar expressed his amazement to the sergeant. I know he looks like he ought to be in 3-cornered pants, but by God, he's a Marine. He looks as if he must sleep at attention. You know, I always have to tell him to look mean and nasty out there marching, but I never had to tell him he's a natural. And he never makes the same mistake twice. He's already made the company #1 for parades, and he did it by himself. Right? That line really stuck out to me. This is his boot camp drill instructor talking about him. He says he never makes the same mistake twice. This reminds me of Charlie Munger's definition of learning. Learning is not acquiring knowledge. Learning is changing your behavior, right? If we're not changing our behavior, if we're not taking these stories, and even me from this podcast right now, I can study these stories, I can learn these stories all I want and memorize them. If I don't actually take them and apply it to my life, it is worthless and I have not learned anything, right? That's why I thought about this line and think it's really important to remember from Chesty here. He never makes the same mistake twice. He learns, he changes his behavior once he sees that he's making a mistake, right? When we talked about Naval from the Naval podcast, one of the things he mentioned was all learning is error correction, right? Whenever you learn something, you make an error, you correct that error, you change that behavior. Chesty is already doing a great job of that from his first time in boot camp. So with that, that is where I'm going to wrap up kind of the Chesty's childhood story. And now we are going to move in to the 18 lessons that we can learn from Chesty in his career as a Marine. And I'm going to kind of go in order of his career. So starting in Haiti and then on to Nicaragua, World War II, and then Korea. So these lessons will kind of mirror his trajectory through the Marines. And obviously we'll be touching on stories from his career throughout it. So here we go. Here is the first story. It says, and this is from his time in Haiti. Company A had waded the stream without opposition, but as they mounted a ridge beyond, a rifle fired and there was a terrifying shriek of a bullet overhead. Puller ducked, and the lieutenant was at his side. Captain Puller, officers do not flinch under fire. They stand. The men take note of this thing. It's of first importance. I'm all right. What makes those damn things sing like that? It rattled me. I never heard such a sound. Captain, you never hear the bullet that hits you. It is one of the few blessings of battle. And this is a lesson where, so obviously, Chesty, here the lesson is do not flinch under fire. The men take note of this thing. So it's his first time in battle. A rifle cracks off. Well, this is actually isn't his very first one. So he's been in a battle or two before this story. But essentially, he hears a rifle crack. He ducks immediately. He flinches. The officer next to him says, hey, Chesty, you cannot flinch under fire. You're an officer. You are supposed to stand there. The men take note. If you duck, you cannot do that. The reason this story sticks out in particular is because this is something that Chesty takes to heart. Like we just talked about, Chesty never makes the same mistake twice. He does not make this mistake again, and he becomes absolutely notorious for not flinching under fire. And that's something, as we get into the Nicaragua campaign in World War II and Korea, he does not flinch under fire, and that's something he is well known for. So as I'm reading this story, obviously this is a war story. We're talking about flinching under gunfire. How can we take that story and apply it to our lives, since obviously I'm not fighting in a war and I'm not a soldier? So I'm reminded of this story from Jocko when I asked myself that question, how can I apply this to my life? And there's the story that Jocko talks about. And I tried to find it. I could not find it. Hopefully one day I come back across it so I can mark it down and share it. But he's talking about how when he was on one of his combat deployments, I can't remember if it was his 2003 one or 2006 in Ramadi, but he talks about how essentially something went south, not on a mission that he was on, but just in the area, something went south and investigations were starting to happen, right? So there was pressure coming in from the top. People were starting to investigate, hey, what happened here? I can't remember if it was like a blue on blue where American forces fired on American forces and someone got killed. I don't remember exactly what it was. I just remember that it was essentially the pressure was building, investigations were starting, and people were starting to get antsy about it. And Jocko was essentially wondering, hey, how is this commander going to handle this situation, right? He's got all this pressure coming down on him. How is he going to operate? And Jocko says that when he walked in to chat with the commander was pretty calm and collected and said, hey, you've got to expect these types of things to happen. And Jocko talks about how much that moment had an effect on him. Like, oh my goodness, like how kind of epic is that? Like, here's this leader who just had this horrible thing happen to him, and he's about to get all this pressure on him. He's about to get investigated. And here he is saying, like, hey, you've got to expect these types of things to happen. So as I heard that story, it gets me thinking, like, hey, how do we act when things go south? Are we ready for those situations? And especially as leaders, right? Because it's important to remember what the lieutenant says here. Officers don't flinch under fire. They stand. The men take note of these things. So whenever you're in a leadership position, or really any position within an organization, when things start going south, people are watching how you're going to act, and they're watching how you are going to handle that situation. And in this example from Jocko, he talks about how calm and collected the leader was in handling this situation, and how much confidence that gave him, and what he learned from that story. So I thought that was a really good story, and I thought it related to Chesty's story. And hey, how do we take this lesson from Chesty on not flinching under fire and apply that to our own lives? All right, moving on to the second story. This is another story from Haiti. It's talking about Chesty's walking with his Haitian soldiers. They're out looking for the bandits, and he sees a beautiful horse. And he makes this comment of, hey, that's a wonderful horse. I'd surely like to have him. And when he says that, he hears a rifle crack, and he sees the horse's rider floating down the river, because the horse was standing in the river. And here we go into the book. It says, did you order that man shot? Hell, sir, you said you wanted the horse. Anything the captain says is our command. We have discipline here, sir. The men seemed unmoved by the cold-blooded killing. My God, catch the horse, get the men over the river, and see if you can find that man's family. Lewis never again expressed himself idly before these soldiers. So this is one of the stories that Jocko covered in the Jocko podcast number 121. And one of the takeaways that he mentions from this story is the fact that when you are a leader, your words carry weight. And he talks about how new leaders and young leaders often struggle with that concept, and they don't really understand the weight of the words that they're saying, right? Whenever you say something, people are listening to those things, and they can misinterpret it, or they maybe take it at face value. So you just need to be careful with the words that you are saying. And so here we are again. I'm trying to take this war story from Chesty Puller and think about, hey, how can we apply that to our lives, given that we are soldiers? And one of the things that I was reminded of was this quote from Jeff Bezos when he's on the Lex Fridman podcast. One of the things he talks about is how at Amazon, he learned to be the last person to talk in meetings. And that's what he would strive to do, is be the last person to talk. And he said that he did that because he learned through his time at Amazon that even strong-willed people would change their opinions if Jeff spoke first. So if Jeff said something early on in a meeting that showed like, hey, this is where his head was at, that might change other people's opinions, and that would result in him not hearing all of the ideas, right? And so he learned to say, hey, we're going to structure our meetings to where the most junior person is going to start first, and we're going to essentially talk in order of superiority, I guess reverse superiority. So the most junior person is talking first. And he is doing that because he understands that his words carry weight. And if he says something, that might change the opinion of everybody else in the room. So I think that is a good example of, hey, how do we take this war story from Chesty about learning to not express himself idly in front of the men and apply that to our daily lives? I think this example from Jeff Bezos is a really great example of that. All right, moving on to story in lesson number 3. This is another story from Haiti. So Chesty actually meets a guy named Louis Coquelel, and he is a Medal of Honor recipient from World War I. And so Chesty is sitting down with him for a night, and here we go to the book. It says, one day when Louis led his patrol to a supply dump in the field, he met Louis Coquelel, one of the legendary characters of the Corps, a dark, barrel-shaped man who spoke rapidly in broken English, a Serbian cook who had won the Medal of Honor in the World War. In his tent that night, Puller got the benefit of a kukla explosion. We fight this war like damn fools, Puller. They scatter us like peas all over Haiti. Kukla patrol 1P, you 1P. They put us in a few posts, and damned if we can leave the tents to find the enemy. This is not war. This outpost waiting drives me mad. If they want to fight, they must bring us all together and send us out to find the Kakos and end this thing. So essentially, yeah, Kukula is in Haiti with Lewis, and he's getting frustrated that the commanders are making them essentially sit in these tents, and they're scattered all across this area in Haiti. They're not concentrating their force together, and they're making them wait in their tents instead of going out and finding the enemy. Back to the book. It says, Puller listened to Kukula for hours and remembered that night. I learned one of the great lessons of warfare from him, concentration of force. It was familiar to me from having read Caesar and Napoleon, but no one put it like Kukula. And he was one of the first critics of the American warfare I had met. We still have not learned the lesson of military concentration in America, and I can't see why. It's plain in every worthwhile textbook. Right? And so as I'm reading this story, as I'm thinking about concentration of force and Chesty learning this lesson from Lewis, there's really two things here. There's one is the concentration of force lesson that he learns from Kukula, right? Because he's saying like, hey, we're all scattered across the country. We need to all come together and focus and fight the enemy here, right? So as I'm thinking about that part, I'm reminded of Steve Jobs. And when he comes back to Apple in the second half of the 1990s, and they have, I looked it up, it looks like it's on the order of 300 to 350 different products that they were trying to build and sell. And when Steve Jobs comes back, he says, scratch all of this. And there's this line where I think he asks, and I know I covered it on the last podcast, where he says, hey, which one of these do I recommend to my friend? Right. So essentially what he comes in there and he just slashes all of these products and narrows it down to 4. He focuses the entire company and puts all his company focusing on only these 4 core products, right? That's what I think about concentration of force. He's got all these teams scattered across Apple working on all of these different projects. And he says, nope, that's not going to work. That's why things are not going well. We need to concentrate all our efforts on a very small number of things. And that's what Kukula is talking about here, talking about concentration of force and learning that lesson. I think the second kind of takeaway from this story is something that we'll see Puller do later in his career. He talks about how Kukula was one of the first critics of American warfare that he had met. And that is something that Chesty is not afraid to do later in the book, right? He is not afraid to criticize the American war effort and how Americans are approaching that war. And he's always doing it in the theme of, hey, how can we learn from this to not make those mistakes again? So I think he does it in a light that's, hey, wanting to learn and wanting to save lives of people. But he, like I said, this is one of his first experiences listening to someone who is critical of the American warfare. And I think that's something that he learns to understand because that is what allows him to learn and change his tactics on his own. All right, moving along to number 4. So here's another story. This is actually between his time in Haiti and Nicaragua. So he's finished up in Haiti. He's done fighting there. And now he's back in the States and he's in a classroom. Here we go back to the book. It says, Puller sometimes came into open disagreements with instructors. One lecturer told the students that volume of fire in the field was more important than accuracy. That brought Puller to his feet. You must have forgotten what happened in the American Revolution, he said. We won that war with accurate fire when the enemy had all the volume. It won at Kings Mountain and Saratoga and every other battle we won. And the real shooting almost whipped the mass-firing Federal Army in the Civil War. It's still like that. Anywhere I've seen men shooting it out, you don't hurt them if you don't hit them. There was applause from the class. So here you go. You can already see Chesty starting to learn to push back on authority. He's in these classes. He's already got all this experience in Haiti, which makes him one of the more experienced Marines. And so he's already pushing back in his classes saying, nope, volume of fire is not superior to accuracy. If you don't hit them, you don't hurt them. And once again, I know I'm saying this over and over again, but this is the question I'm asking myself as I read this book about Chesty is how do we take these lessons and apply them? What other lessons have I learned that relate to this lesson from Chesty? And as I was thinking about this lesson of the accuracy of fire more than or is greater than the volume of fire, I was reminded of the 20 punch card ticket that we learned from when we were studying Charlie Munger. And he talks about Warren Buffett. And he says one of the things Warren teaches in business school is, I could improve your ultimate financial welfare by giving you a ticket with only 20 slots in it so that you had 20 punches representing all the investments that you got to make in a lifetime. And once you punched through the card, you couldn't make any more investments at all. He says under those rules, you'd really think carefully about what you did and you'd be forced to load up on what you really thought about so you do much better, right? I think that is a very simple analogy. They're talking about investing. It's not about the volume of investments. It's about making good investments, getting the right hits. That's why he says, hey, if I could do something to help you improve your ultimate financial welfare, I would limit you to 20 shots on goal. So you have to focus and make sure that you hit the ones that you go for. And I think that ties into this idea of the accuracy of the fire being more important than the volume. Now, obviously, that said, I think volume is still a very important thing. You know, whether you're talking about like Alex Hormozy, one of the things that he talks about a lot is you can't be doing a ton of different businesses. You need to focus on one, but within that business, you need to find something that works. You need to find the highest leverage activity and just do that over and over and over again and get a ton of volume behind that, right? And when I was talking to Jed last week about this book, one of the things he said when we were talking about this idea of accuracy of fire versus volume of fires, like, yeah, you definitely want to be accurate, but if you are accurate, volume is very nice on top of that as well. So that's another really cool lesson from the book, this idea of accurate fire versus the volume of fire. All right. So this next lesson, number 5, is a story from Nicaragua. And so they're going after bandits, kind of a similar situation to Haiti. Chesty is with a lot of these local soldiers and they're going after these bandits. And in this story, he finds out that there's this town or village about 30 miles south of where he's at, where the bandits are. And he gets ordered to march down to that city and capture and kill the bandits and their supplies. And so as he's marching down, he learns that the bandits have left the village and they are going to his left. So instead of continuing to head to the village, he essentially skates to where the puck is going and he turns left and his men chase down the bandits. They capture them and kill them. And I think they walk away with 82 mules or something like that. They get a bunch of their supplies. And when Puller gets back to talk to the major, this is what happens. Diving into the book, it says, this is the major talking. Why did you disobey my orders? You should have gone directly south as I told you. Chesty replies, if I'd done that, you'd never have gotten these animals, and I'd never have seen the bandits. They'd still be tearing up the countryside. I always carry out orders implicitly. And if I had not found the enemy, I would have marched south before coming back in. Since we were successful, it seems to me it didn't matter whether I carried out the letter of the order. The major studied Puller's face, hesitated, and nodded in dismissal. I love that line there. He says, I always carry out orders implicitly. And this, as I was reading this, I was reminded of another one of Napoleon's maxims. It was number 72 from the book. It says, a general in chief has no right to shelter his mistake in war under cover of his sovereign when these are both distant from the scene of operation, and must consequently be either ill-informed or wholly ignorant of the actual state of things. So this is that lesson from Napoleon. One of the things that he was big on was, hey, if you are given an order from a commander who is not there in the field with you and does not know the conditions on the ground, it is your responsibility to not follow that order if it doesn't make sense. And that's exactly what Chesty's doing here. The order is to go down, march to this village because the bandits are there. Chesty understands that the implicit why behind this mission is to go capture and kill the bandits. It is not just to get to this town. So what does he do when he finds out the bandits had left? He turns left and he goes, finds the enemy and captures and kills the enemy. And I love that line. He says, I follow orders implicitly. That's something that I think is super important for us to do. And it is one of those things that sounds simple. In this story, you can kind of read it and think like, oh, that's simple. Obviously, that's the right thing to do. But I think it's not always as simple as it sounds. And it's super important to make sure that you, whatever position you're in, whether we're in a leadership position or follower position, make sure you understand the why behind it so that you can follow the orders implicitly, even if that means not necessarily following the explicit order that was given. And that actually ties directly into lesson number 6 from the book. So this lesson comes from a guy named Bill Lee. He's someone who worked with Chesty in Nicaragua, and he's talking about what kind of leader Chesty was. He says, he never really gave me orders. He just told me what headquarters wanted, asked if I knew the country, and to get up the men we needed. He was a common sense officer, and you always knew where you stood with him. When he was displeased about something I'd done, he never chewed me out, as so many inexperienced officers would have done. He would say, if I'd been doing that, I'd have done it this way. And that would be the end of it. We got on like brothers, and most important of all, he was not green when he first came to Nicaragua. Haiti had taught him jungle fighting, and he took to the new country like a native. So obviously this is a great leadership style from Chesty, right? Instead of giving his soldiers, here's a list of everything you need to do, and I want it done exactly this way, he very simply says, hey, this is what headquarters wants. What do you need for me to go do it? Go execute on it. And we can look at the story and acknowledge that, yes, this is great leadership from Chesty. But one of the things that I remember thinking about when I first read this book and first listened to the Jocko podcast is, how do I become someone like Bill Lee, right? How can you be someone who all that your superior needs to do is tell you what the mission is and not give you the details so that you can go execute it? And I know I want to do that because just the independence and freedom that comes with it, right? I feel like you get a lot more independence and freedom if you can operate in that kind of manner, and you can build that kind of trust with your bosses. So I think that's a really important question that I was asking myself early on is, hey, how do I become more like Billy? How do I get to a spot where my commanding officer, obviously not in the military, but my superior at work trusts me enough to just say, hey, here's what needs to get done. Go do it. And that's it. And as I was saying about that, I'm reminded of another story from Steve Jobs when we were studying him a few weeks ago. And one of the things Steve Jobs talks about at the Aspen Design Conference in 1983, so this is while he was working on the Macintosh project, he talks about how we hire people at Apple to tell us what to do. Here we go to his quote. It says, the reason we hire people is to tell us what to do. At Apple, when you get hired, some people survive and some don't. But in general, it's, hey, this is the general thing we think we need to do. Go figure out what we need, come back and tell us how much it's going to cost, and go do it, right? So that's how at Apple they were hiring people. And I think it's just an important story for us to remember, because especially early on in my career, I thought that my job was to do what I was told to do by the people above me, right? I think that's a very common frame that a lot of us have, when in reality, I think it's very useful to think of it the way that Bill Lee is thinking about it here, and Steve Jobs talks about it, is, hey, when you are hired to tell your boss what needs to get done and what to do. Your boss is going to give you a mission. They're going to tell you why you need to do something, and in general, what is trying to get accomplished. And then it is your job as a subordinate to go to them and tell them how it's going to get done in the best way, how much it's going to cost, how many resources it's going to take, how you would approach that problem. And I think when you operate in that frame, that is what then leads to the kind of trust that Bill Lee had with Chesty Puller in this story. And then that trust essentially leads to you having a whole lot more independence and freedom in your job. And that's certainly what I wanted as a young man in my career, was to gain that trust so that I could have the freedom and independence to work on things the way that I thought they should be worked on. All right, moving on. Next lesson, number 7. This is a fun story. So this is after Nicaragua. This is Chesty has taken over the 1-7 Marines. This is prior to World War II and going to Guadalcanal. So he's in charge of this new unit, and it talks about how one of the things that he puts his unit through, there's so many great stories on how he trains this unit. I should say this again. I'm just hitting the wave tops of this book. There are so many stories, so many lessons, so many great things to learn from Chesty here. I'm just touching on this one. I had to cut out a whole lot just for time's sake. But here we go. This one it's a simple story. It's about communication. He talks about how he makes his guys play the telephone game, a game that I played even when I was a very young child. He has these guys, the runners, he sets them all 100 yards apart. He tells one guy a message at this one end. He tells them to sprint to the next guy, who sprints to the next guy, who sprints to the next guy. They pass this message down the line. And what do you know? Once he gets to the end of the line, the message is completely different than the message that he gave the first person. And he says, "Open your ears. You'll have to do this until you learn. When you carry a message in combat, the life of every man in the outfit may ride with you." And I love this. It's just a great reminder that practicing the elementary things is super important, even as we're adults, right? He takes over this new unit. They're about to go to war. And what is he practicing? He's practicing communication via playing the telephone game with his runners, right? I think that's one of the reasons why Charlie Munger in Poor Charlie's Almanac and in the speeches he gives, he calls it elementary world wisdom, right? It's the elementary things. It's these things that are so simple that catch us up. And when we fail to do those elementary things, that's when things fall apart, right? And so that's why I really like this example from Chesty Puller, just making his guys play this simple game of telephone so that they can see how poor their own communication is when handling these very, very simple messages that people's lives may depend on. So that's something I think every year throughout my career, I learn more and more and more the importance of clear communication and just how difficult it is, even though it seems like such an elementary thing for us to do. Most of the problems that I cause and that I've run into in my career are communication problems, and oftentimes it is very elementary mistakes that I have made along the way. All right, story lesson number 8. This is another one from him training these guys before going off to Guadalcanal in World War II. This one is about a 22-mile march that's in the searing heat. This is on one of the islands in the Pacific, and so it's just extremely hot. He's going to march his guys for 22 miles under the searing sun, and he essentially tells the guys, like, hey, you guys better finish this march or fall down unconscious on your face trying. And so here we go to the book. It says, Private Gerald White wrote for his diary, "Puller must have marched twice the distance we did. For all day long he kept marching up and down the column, jaunty as a bantam rooster, pipe clenched in his teeth, ever alert to see the men who were succumbing to the heat, exhaustion, or blisters were taken care of by corpsmen. Many times I saw him take a bar, machine gun, or mortar off the shoulder of some Marine whose fanny was dragging and carry it to give the poor guy some respite. Dr. Smith looked at the major expectantly at the end of the march, but got a surprise. Puller never even batted an eye over the march. He came steaming into camp as fresh as when he started." So that's just an incredible story. Chesty, it's important to mention, he is 44 years old at this point, right? And most of these guys that are under his command are obviously in their young 20s. And he takes them on this 22-mile march in the searing heat. Guys are falling down, passing out, are struggling to finish this march. And the entire time, Chesty's marching up and down the line. So he's walking a whole lot farther than the 22 miles of the march. And he's taking equipment off the guys, carrying the machine guns or the mortar or the bars to help out guys that are struggling. And even though he's 44 years old, he finishes the march. And it says he came in steaming into the camp as fresh as when he started. So as I was reading this story, one of the things I was reminded of was a lesson from William McRaven from podcast number 8. And one of the things he says in that book, The Wisdom of the Bullfrog, is a shepherd should smell like his sheep, right? And that's exactly what Chesty is doing here. He's out there with the men marching up and down the column. He is not making them march on their own. He's not hopping in a Jeep to drive next to them while they're doing the march. He is in it with them. And another thing that I was thinking of was, we haven't covered this book yet, but I'm sure I will at some point. This book, About Face, Jocko covers it on Jocko podcast number 2. But in that book, which is written by David Hackworth, one of the leaders that he learned from was a guy named Colonel Glover Johns. And one of the things that Glover Johns talks about is how showmanship is a vital technique of leadership. And how as a leader, you've got to have a little bit of showmanship to you. And William McRaven calls this swagger. And I think this is one of those stories, and like I said, there's countless stories like this in the book, where I think this is kind of an example of Chesty having a little bit of showmanship, right? He's out marching these guys. He marches up and down the column. He's not passing out. He still looks fresh at the end of it, even though his guys are completely struggling. All right, moving on to lesson number 9. This is actually going to take place from a story in Guadalcanal. So he's done training the guys. They've now arrived in Guadalcanal, and they are in the thick of the fighting. I can't remember if I've mentioned it already today, but there's Band of Brothers, which covers the Easy Company going through Europe in World War II. There's also another series called the Pacific, which covers the island hopping campaign in the Pacific. And in that series, Guadalcanal is actually covered. And there's even an actor who's Chesty in that series as well. So highly recommend checking out that series. But this story comes from Guadalcanal. It says Puller saw some of his officers and men in the evening, but had little to say. The next day, back in the main defense line of the perimeter, he called together the battalion officers. His voice was hard and his face unsmiling. Gentlemen, at least we've all been blooded now. I don't want you to be mourning over our losses and feeling sorry for yourselves or taking all the blame on your shoulders. We've all got to leave this world someday. We're all in the same pickle, and there are worse things than dying for your country. Some things about our action in the last 4 days I want you to remember forever. There are some we'd all like to forget, but they'll be on your mind's eye for as long as you live. I hope we've all learned something. Now take care of your men and make yourselves ready. We haven't seen anything yet. One other thing. Back there on the hillside at Mount Austin, I had trouble getting company officers up. I hope you saw what that cost us in casualties. Never again do I want to see that in my command. I want to see officers leading. I want you to know that you're leaders and not simply commanders. You cannot operate a military force in the field under these conditions with commanders alone. Civilians wouldn't know what I was talking about, but you found out now that it's true. There are many qualities in a man, but one that is absolutely necessary in an infantry leader is stark courage. Give that idea to your men in your own way. Don't worry over things that are done that we can no longer help. Concentrate on building a better combat unit because that's the best hope of us all surviving. None of us could help the fact that I was the only combat trained man in our outfit before we began. I was lucky enough to get the jolt when I was young. You'll come along fast and there will be work for us. Let's be ready when our time comes. So that's one of my favorite speeches from Chesty Puller in the book. They got into Guadalcanal, they get in a firefight, and he has a lot of his officers are struggling to get up. They're not getting up. They're not leading their men, and that costs Chesty and his group a whole lot of casualties at Guadalcanal. And one of the things he does here is obviously he's getting on his guys. He tells them that he's not happy with the way they operated, but then he goes on and says, don't worry over things that are done that we can no longer help. Concentrate on building a better combat unit because that's the best hope of us all surviving. So he tells the guys that he's not happy with what they did, exactly what they did wrong. He shows them the behavior that he wants them to change and says, hey, don't worry over these things. Don't linger on them. Learn from them, change it, and move on. And that sounds exactly like the lesson that we learned from McCraven in podcast number 8 when he says you've got to be ready to make the next tough decision, right? That was his primary advice to young leaders. That's exactly what's happening with Chesty here. Chesty has these young leaders who are green and they've made a mistake, and he needs them to learn from the mistake and make the next tough decision. So I thought that was great. It also reminds me from the very beginning of the book when it says Chesty never made the same mistake twice. That's essentially what he's telling his guys to do here. And he understands that his young leaders that are green aren't going to make mistakes. He says, we can't help that. I was the only combat trained man before we got here, but that's no longer the case. Don't make this mistake again. All right, moving on to lesson number 10. This has to do with modulating your leadership. That's a phrase that I learned from Jocko, that you have to modulate your leadership based on who you're talking to, the different people that you're working with. Like always, I think this applies to people who are directly in leadership positions as in being a superior, but I think everyone is a leader, and I think we all have something to learn here on modulating how we interact with everyone around us. So Chesty was kind of known from the outside. If you hadn't worked with him, people thought he was kind of a hard ass and tough on the soldiers, but those who worked with him knew that he had a ton of love for the soldiers and that he would do anything for them. And so there's a bunch of different examples throughout the entire book of him taking time to sit down one-on-one with somebody and talking with them. Sometimes that looked like pushing him and being a little bit harsh with them, and sometimes that looked like him showing a little bit of empathy. So I'm going to touch on 2 of these stories that show a little bit of the dichotomy and how he modulates his leadership. based on where different people are at. But like I said, there's just countless examples in the book of where he does this. Oh, so Chesty's in the hospital right now. He's just gotten hit for his first time, and he's now in the hospital. Here we go to the book. It says, one day a new patient was placed in the cot next to Puller just a foot away. The boy had come from the 5th Marines, a shell-shock case. He trembled and whimpered constantly and babbled in the night. The colonel made efforts to help him, but the boy was hostile. After the first few days, Puller noticed that the young man no longer had tremors except when he knew he was being watched. There's no such thing as shell shock or battle fatigue, Puller said. All in the mind. Until I got in this war, I never saw a bit of it. We fought all up and down Haiti and Nicaragua without it. You'll be okay. After an air alert one day, when the boy had crouched in an underground shelter for a long time, after the all clear sounded, he returned to his cot, took from his billfold the photograph of a pretty girl, and began to cry. Puller looked over his shoulder. Too bad you'll never see her again, he said. What do you mean? Why? Well, she'll never look at you again after this. She wouldn't spit on you. She'll never know. How could she hear? Oh, she'll find out. You ever see those big wanted posters in post offices? That's what the Marine Corps does with its goof-offs. Your picture will go right up there. She'll find out all right. The boy reached under his cot and Puller tensed, thinking he was after his pistol. The sobbing boy dragged out his pack and hurried from the tent. A medical corpsman soon entered. Colonel, you shouldn't talk to a man like that. You brutalized him. It's just what he needed. You mind your business, old man. The doctor appeared the next morning at Puller's cot, grinning. Colonel, I told you that I'd send you back to your battalion within a week, but I'm going to recommend that you stay right here instead. You could do more for the war effort. Did you know that corpsman of mine put you on report this morning? No, and I don't give a damn. He reported you for roughing up that kid you sent out there, but you know what? I called the 5th Marines, and damned if he isn't back on duty, chin up and ready to go. Whatever you did was just the medicine for him. Puller later heard that the boy was decorated for bravery on the island. So I love that story. I just think it's a fantastic example. Puller is injured. He gets hurt. He's in the hospital. There's a young boy in there who's tremoring from shell shock, but Puller recognizes that this young man is only trembling whenever people are watching, and whenever people are not watching, he's not trembling. So Puller takes a pretty direct and aggressive approach with the young man, saying, hey, you see that pretty girl in the picture you're holding? She will never look at you again because she's going to find out how you acted here and that you were being a coward while you were here. And the young boy walks out of the tent, ends up going back to fight with the 5th Marines, and then ends up later being decorated for bravery on the island, right? So Puller knew how to modulate his leadership to tell this kid what he needed to hear to help him and his unit get back in line, right? And I think that's one of the important things is that kid, it says he got later was decorated for bravery on the island. I bet you that kid had a whole lot more self-respect for himself because the way Puller approached that situation. And as I was reading that story, I was also reminded of something we learned from both Charlie Munger and Benjamin Franklin. And because Charlie Munger learned it from Benjamin Franklin, was this idea that if you wish to persuade, appeal to interest and not to reason. And that's exactly what Chesty does here. He's not appealing to the reason of like, hey, shell shock isn't a thing. I don't believe in it. He appeals to the young man's interest. The young man wants this girl to like him and to admire him. And so that's what Chesty hits on. He wants to persuade the young man and he appeals to interest and not to reason, a lesson that we've already heard from Charlie and Benjamin Franklin. So that's one story. Here's another story from the book on how Chesty handles another guy. It says, Puller had found one demoralized boy stonily in his hole, looking out with a telltale 1,000-yard stare. He muttered over and over, Colonel, we got to get the hell out of here. That's no way to talk, old man. Puller led the boy back a few paces to the rear and sat with him for 10 minutes or so. Look, old man, I want to go home too. I'm not getting any younger. Hell, I'm 45 years old. You know what? I got a family at home. I know this dump is no good, but neither of us is going home until we lick these bastards. We've got to help make our folks safe back home. I'll try to get you some hot chow up here, old man. The boy went back to his hole with a brighter look in his eye. So like I said, that's another case. There's a guy on the front lines. He's got that telltale 1,000-yard stare. What does Chesty do in that case? He doesn't jump down on the man and tell him to stay there. He takes the man, walks him a few paces back from the front line, sits him down, talks to him, lets him have a second, and then says the boy went back to his hole with a brighter look in his eye. I think Chesty is very good at modulating his leadership. Like I said, there's a ton of stories in the book talking about this. Get the book, read it, because there's just so many great examples of how Chesty does this. All right, here is story and lesson number 11. This actually happens when this is after Guadalcanal, and Chesty comes back to the United States, and he's talking to reporters. And as he's talking to reporters, obviously they're asking him to give an update on Guadalcanal, and he explains the situation on the number of American troops, the number of Japanese troops, the casualties on both sides, and he's very confident that he thinks the U.S. should be able to completely take Guadalcanal soon. And here we go into the book. It says, reporters noted that he said nothing about his wounds and little of the action in which his battalion had saved Henderson Field. So Chesty was in Guadalcanal. They had taken this airfield, Henderson Field. He's back in the United States, and these reporters are asking him about Guadalcanal. And the reason this story stuck out to me, it says he did not talk about his wounds or of the action of his battalion, right? So he'd gotten wounded. He had a bunch of casualties in his own battalion, men killed, men wounded. And instead of talking about that, he understands that when he's talking to these reporters, he needs to talk about the big picture and communicate the big picture of what's going on in Guadalcanal. And he communicates that very simply and effectively. And this story stuck with me because it's something that I have struggled with. I think it's been a tendency for me, and I think a lot of people, whenever you're in the trenches working on something, especially if you have a lot of passion in it, and in this case, obviously Chesty literally has lost men and had casualties and had his men wounded and killed. Whenever I'm that deep into something, it's hard for me to detach far enough to where I'm not talking about the details of what I'm seeing on the front lines. That's a very hard thing. One of the questions that I learned to ask myself is, hey, if there's 100% of the stuff that I'm doing, how much of that actually needs to get communicated? Is it 20% of what I'm doing needs to get communicated? Is it 10%? It's normally a very small slither of what you're doing that actually needs to get communicated out. So that's simple and effective when you're doing that communication. And that's something that Chesty is very good at. And he does here. When he's talking to these reporters, he does not dive into the details. He doesn't talk about his wounds or his unit individually. He's able to detach completely and talk about the big picture. So, like I said, one of those things that sounds very simple, but it's very, very, very hard to do, at least for me, in my experience. All right, lesson number 12. Here we go. This is one of my absolute favorite stories from the book, and it's a line that I have never forgotten from the time that I first heard it on the Jocko podcast when he talks about it. And this is, like I said, this is from his time back in the United States after Guadalcanal. He's traveling around the U.S. teaching the lessons he's learned at Guadalcanal. So here we go. Back to the book. It says, Puller went on the road covering army posts in the Midwest and the Far West. As usual, he did not shun sacred military precincts, and he expanded on previous talks. So throughout his travels here, he is not shy about bashing the military and the mistakes that they made and the lessons that they should be learning, right? Call back to Kukula, that lesson that he learned from him. Kukula was one of the first people that he heard talk about the mistakes that the American military was making. Chesty's not scared to do that. And as he's going around the U.S., that is what he's doing. Back to the book. This is Chesty talking. It says, we just don't know all we ought to know about warfare on land or sea. Just off Guadalcanal not long ago, we lost 3 cruisers, blasted down by Jap guns as they sat there, sitting ducks, that's all. I'll tell you exactly why we lost them. The admiral in charge got a plane report that a Jap force was approaching at 14 knots by daylight. So he figured that at that speed, the enemy couldn't arrive in his waters before the next dawn. After dark, of course, the Japs stepped up their speed to 28 knots and got to the scene at 3 a.m. when our men were not even at battle stations. It happened like that, I'm positive. And instead of keeping such things secret, we ought to have them emblazoned at the gate of every naval station. We must not be too proud or too stupid to profit by our mistakes, and God knows we make them. Right? That line, we must not be too proud or stupid to profit from our own mistakes. So this is just a fantastic lesson. He's talking about how in the Pacific, they had these 3 ships that end up getting sunk. The reason that they're sunk is they see the Japanese forces, the ships coming in at 14 knots during the day. And so they calculate, all right, they're going to get here tomorrow. All the men are not at their battle stations at overnight. Once night falls, the Japanese forces speed up to 28 knots. They reach them at 3 o'clock in the morning and sink the American ships. And Chesty's saying, hey, we aren't talking about this. People are hiding this mistake that we made. And instead of keeping these things a secret, we ought to have them emblazoned on the gate of every naval station. We must not be too proud or too stupid to profit by our mistakes. And God knows we make them, right? That's just an incredibly powerful story. How often do we take the time to sit down and really detail the really, really ugly and bad mistakes that we make and share them with, number one, ourselves, and then with other people, so that we collectively as a team do not make those mistakes again? I think it sounds very simple and obvious when you hear it put this way, but it's not something that we naturally do. It's not our natural tendency to really want to love to talk about the big mistakes we make, especially when the result of that is losing ships, right? As I'm thinking about this, I'm reminded of Naval's rom-coms we already talked about in this podcast. All learning is error correction. You've got to study those errors and correct them and make sure they don't happen again. I just love that line. We must not be too proud or too stupid to profit from our own mistakes. That line has stuck with me ever since the first time I heard it on the Jocko podcast. All right, moving on. Number 13. This is another lesson that Chesty has after Guadalcanal. And this one, I was debating whether or not I should touch on it because it has to do with prisoners of war, but I think it's just a really interesting example to talk about. So Chesty here, he's talking about how different countries treat prisoners of war. And like I said, this is World War II. We're talking Guadalcanal here. He says that Japanese soldiers aren't allowed to return home if they are taken prisoner. They have made captivity the ultimate disgrace for a soldier. That's what Chesty says. The Japanese have made captivity the ultimate disgrace for a soldier. The British Army, they stop pay for soldiers who get captured. But in America, they double the pay of the captured soldiers, and their time in captivity counts toward promotion. So he's talking about how these different countries treat captured soldiers differently. And here we go. This is Chesty talking in the book. It says, God knows I have sympathy for a prisoner of war, and I know all of you have. But we're not following an intelligent line on this. It sounds like a policy dreamed up by inexperienced staff officers to me. From the field commander's point of view, it is ruinous. Right. And so as I'm reading this, I'm reminded of one of the lessons we learned from Charlie Munger. He says, show me the incentive and I'll show you the outcome. One of the things Charlie talked about is how he thinks that he understood incentives more than almost anyone else. And he still says that every year he underestimated the power of incentives. And that's exactly what Chesty is talking about here. He's talking about how they have incentivized soldiers to get captured because their pay is going to get doubled and they're still going to get promotions. That's how the American military is operating. And he talks about how the Japanese folks, they have made getting captured the ultimate disgrace for a soldier, and how the British have removed pay for soldiers who get captured, right? So they're talking about incentives. It's a very delicate example. Obviously, we're talking about prisoners of war, but that's what Chesty is saying here. And just as a refresher, what Charlie Munger, the example he gives about the power of incentives is the FedEx example, where they're trying to get this overnight shipping thing worked out. And obviously they fly all the planes to this one location. And in the middle of the night, they have to have these workers move all of the packages from plane to plane to make sure it's on the correct plane so that it can get out the next morning. And FedEx is struggling to get this logistically to work. They can't get all of the work done in that shift that they need to. And so what do they end up doing? Someone comes up with the idea to pay the people by the shift, and they get to go home when the work is done instead of being paid by the hour. And what do you know? Once they do that, the problem clears up overnight. That's Charlie Munger's example of incentive. So like I said, this was a story I debated on putting in here since it's talking about prisoners of war and how Chesty thinks America is being too generous to him, but I think it really highlights on the power of incentives. And that's something that Charlie Munger talks about a lot and holds very highly in all of his different models. The power of incentives is one of his top ones that is important to be thinking about, is how are we incentivizing people to act? And here Chesty's saying, hey, our incentive for people to get captured is far too high, and we need to reduce that. God knows I have empathy for him, but that's just not the way to do things. All right, moving on. Number 14, this story comes from Korea. In fact, we talked about this a little bit at the beginning. So in the Chosin Reservoir, they're retreating. Chesty has the rear guard anyways, obviously there's a lot of stuff going on there, but one of the things that he makes the men do, it says Puller was not content until the young lieutenant repeated the order to him. So every time Chesty would give an order, he would make the young lieutenants and the soldiers repeat the order to him so that he knew that they understood what he was trying to communicate to them. We talked earlier about practicing communication with the telephone game. Here we're talking about another communication tactic. Jocko and the folks at Echelon Front would call this a readback. Whenever someone tells you to do something, you can give them a readback so you both understand that you are aligned, and you can confirm that you're aligned because one person says something and the other person reads it back in their own words. And that's a great way to confirm that you're both on the same page about something. This is something Chesty does over and over and over again throughout the book, is he makes people give him that readback so he knows and has confidence that they understood the order that he gave them, right? Back to the idea of focusing on elementary skills, right? This readback is something I think of as being a very elementary skill, and sometimes it feels kind of childish to have to do it, but it has served me so well throughout my time and communicating with other people. All right. Number 15, here we go. Here's another story from Korea to the book. It says, when the company officers had gone, Puller explained, old man, when you have something to say to officers or men, make it snappy. The fewer the words, the better. They won't believe you if you shoot bull. When you face ranks of men and try that, you can hear them sigh in despair when you open your mouth. If they sense you're a phony, they can usually look at you and tell. Maybe it doesn't sound like it, but that's an important thing in a Marine's career. So there's several times throughout the book where Chesty's given a speech, whether it's talking to reporters like we talked about earlier, or he's taking over a unit. Almost every time he does that, he gives very, very short and simple speeches. In his words, he keeps it very snappy. Normally it's on the order of 3 or 4 sentences. He keeps things very simple when he's communicating. I loved that lesson from him. It's something that I've struggled with, is keeping it snappy. He says, when you have something to say to officers or men, make it snappy. And that's something that he is incredibly good at. Here we go. Here's another story from Korea. He's talking about the South Korean soldiers they're fighting with. And so obviously they're fighting the North Koreans and the Chinese. The Americans have these South Korean soldiers that they are working with. And there's some people essentially bad-mouthing the South Koreans, saying that they are not good soldiers. And here we go. It says, the general defended his South Korean allies. This is Chesty talking. Now they're beginning to say the ROKs are no good and that they always run. But they can be good. We've proved that. Don't forget those 3,000 South Korean soldiers, just ordinary soldiers that fought the 5th Marines trained aboard the ship on the way to Incheon. They made them into South Korean Marines. The way they handled them in combat made all the difference. U.S. Marine officers and non-commissioned officers assigned to each unit lived with the troops up on the front line. When they got into fights, these officers used weapons to help stand off the enemy. So the South Korean Marines never broke. But the ROKs who've broken so often are Army trained. It's not because the Army is evil or cowardly. They get the same kind of American boys we get, by and large. The difference is in their attitude and training. Army officers assigned to ROK units didn't live with the troops up front, but stayed in the rear in some kind of staff headquarters. When attacks came, there was nobody around to steady the ROKs, and the officers in the rear headquarters were usually the first to run. Who could expect anything but retreat? I think that's a fantastic story and example of how leaders can affect a situation, right? So what Chesty is talking about here is they're working with these South Korean soldiers, and essentially they're South Korean units that are being trained and led by Marines, and they're South Korean units that are being trained and led by the Army. And the ones with the Marines are up there on the front lines with them in the trenches. And whenever they get into the firefight, the Marines, the leaders that are leading those South Korean forces, are picking up their guns and fighting with and next to these South Korean soldiers. And those South Korean soldiers are not retreating. And then contrast that with the Army. The Army has the South Korean soldiers on the front lines, and then the Army officers are behind the front lines in a staff headquarters. And what happens in that situation? Once they get into a firefight, the Army officers are usually the first ones to retreat. And so obviously the South Korean soldiers with them are just going to fall back immediately. And that's what Chesty is talking about here, is how the leadership of these two different groups of South Korean soldiers lead to very different results from those two teams, right? And so this reminded me of one of the chapters from the book Extreme Ownership by Jocko, The chapter is titled No Bad Team, Only Bad Leaders. And in that chapter, they talk about how it's during BUDS, which is the Navy SEAL training that's famous and has Hell Week and all that stuff. But there's these two boat crews, and one boat crew is winning all the competitions, and they have this fantastic leader and this fantastic group, and they're crushing everybody. And then there's this group that's getting last in every competition. And what the instructors do at this to these boat crews is they swap the leaders. So they take the leader of the best boat crew and put him on the worst one, and then they take the leader of the worst one and put him on the best one. And then those two groups become number 1 and 2 because the guys on the best team help build the leader that was leading the bad team. They make him into a better leader. And then the leader who was a stud, who was leading the best team, goes and leads the men who were on the worst team and leads them to perform and vie for first and win second, get first and second, and compete with that other boat crew. And essentially the whole outcome or lesson from that chapter is that leadership matters and leadership makes a difference in the performance. And that's exactly what we're seeing here from this story about how the Marines handle the South Korean soldiers versus how the Army handles the South Korean soldiers. All right, lesson number 17. This is a really cool lesson. It's something that's mentioned several times throughout the book. Here we go. Diving in on the book, it says the Pentagon is largely responsible for the mess out here. They were given the money to provide and train an army. When I entered the service, the regulations stated that the object of all military training is success in battle. This short sentence has been rewritten on 3 pages, and I defy anyone to read it over 3 or more times and then explain what the object of military training is. Even the Pentagon has not the slightest idea of why they are commanding the forces of the United States. In fact, out here, we wonder if we are even a part of the United States. So I thought that was really great. It's something he says over and over and over again. The mission statement of military training for a long time was just the word success in battle. Very straightforward, extremely simple. And then someone at the Pentagon came in and changed it from that one sentence to 3 pages that made no sense, right? This goes back to just keeping things simple in our communication. I was reminded of something that Sam Altman wrote in one of his blog posts, which is his advice to startups. One of the things he says is set a clear, easy to understand vision for your company and make it a mission people believe in. It's got to be clear. It's got to be easy to understand. People need to know the mission in very simple terms. And this is what Chesty says. The Pentagon made a mistake here. They took a very simple mission and made it extremely complicated in a way that no one understood what the actual mission of military training was. And then the very last one, this is number 18. We'll close out with this one. We touched on it earlier, but this lesson is just learn from history's campaign. Learn from history's campaigns and the great campaigns that have been performed before you. We talked earlier about how much Chesty was reading military histories, whether it was trying to translate Caesar, reading about the Huns. There's a bunch of different stories about that. His wife would actually give him books. She gave him a book on Stonewall Jackson for him to read while he was at war. The book said that he carried Caesar's Gallic Wars for more than 20 years and had it in his pocket during Guadalcanal. So he's constantly reading these books and studying them while he's out in war. And here we go to the book. It says this is after his time in Korea. It says Puller once opened a package from Korea, the last souvenir from that campaign. It was his copy of Henderson's Stonewall Jackson, dirty and worn on every page, with much of the text underlined, and Jackson's mottos copied in margins and on flyleaves in Puller's hand. The firm resolve of Stonewall, never take counsel of your fears, was written large on the pages. At the end of the book, Puller had listed the casualties of his battalion at Guadalcanal and a list of its decorations. The covers of the book were held on with bicycle tape. But a Marine officer who found it in Puller's vacated van in Korea knew that it was priceless to the general. So I just love that. It's a good reminder that even while he's out there, he's fighting in Guadalcanal, while he's fighting in Korea, you got to remember by this point, he is one of the most experienced Marines and military. And even though he has all this experience, he is still relentlessly studying the campaigns of great military leaders, right? So talking here about this copy of Stonewall Jackson that he had written a bunch of the margins. He had written down all his casualties and the decorations that his men had gotten in these books. It just reminds me again of Napoleon's maxim number 778. Peruse again and again the campaigns of great military leaders. This is the only means of becoming a great captain and of acquiring the secret of the art of war. That is exactly what I'm trying to do here with this podcast. Read these books, study them to the extent that I'm able to talk about them and try to articulate these messages, because I think that's a great way to try to solidify these messages more and just really solidify the lessons that we're learning here, right? I mean, we all know that whenever you try to teach something, you end up learning it a whole lot better. And that's exactly what I'm trying to do here. I've got a long way to go, but I think that sums up what I'm trying to do on this podcast. Study the great campaigns of the people that have come before me, because that's the only way of learning the life lessons that we can to become more like them in our own lives. So with that, thank you for Burke Davis for writing this book. Thank you to Chesty Puller and all the Marines, soldiers, sailors, and airmen who have fought and defended us in this country. Thank you, Jocko, for introducing me to him in Jocko podcast number 121. Thank you, Jed, for doing the podcast with me and talking about Chesty and the Marines last week. And so with that, I'll wrap up the podcast there, and I will see you next time.